Nelson and Everly had always been the picture of a perfect couple. Their marriage, at least from the outside, seemed flawless. They lived in a beautiful house nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far enough to avoid the rush of the city but close enough to keep in touch with everything they needed. Their life together was full of routine, comfort, and predictability. Nelson, an engineer for a major oil company, worked long hours at a remote oil rig. His schedule was grueling, spending 2 weeks away from home, followed by 2 weeks back. The job took him to places where his safety was constantly at risk, but it was the kind of job that suited him. It gave him a sense of order and control that he thrived on. He kept his life structured down to the smallest detail, especially when it came to the little things that mattered most to him. One of those things was his collection of fine whiskey. He had spent years curating the perfect set, each bottle placed with precision on the bar cart in their living room. His favorite was Glenlivet, an aged bottle that he had been savoring drop by drop, a memento of the hard work that had gone into his career. It was a small ritual, a way for him to mark the end of his long shifts and feel connected to the quiet moments of life he could only experience when he returned home. Everly, on the other hand, was a different kind of person. She worked as a marketing manager at a prestigious property agency, and her job demanded a level of energy and creativity that Nelson couldn't relate to. Her days were filled with meetings, pitches, and deadlines. She thrived on it. Yet, despite the busy work life, she always tried to make sure she and Nelson spent time together when he was home. She was a believer in balance, in the idea that their different worlds could coexist in harmony. But things weren't as seamless as they appeared. The space between Nelson's long absences and Everly's demanding career meant that they often found themselves disconnected, existing more as housemates than as partners. There was love, yes, but it was a love that began to feel more like a routine, like the ritual of Nelson's whiskey bottle collection, slowly losing its sparkle. Everly had her own coping mechanisms too. As Nelson was away, she found herself sinking into the loneliness of an empty house. She would fill her time with work, friends, and the occasional visit to the gym, but there was always something missing. She began to feel increasingly isolated, missing the intimacy that had once been a fundamental part of their relationship. And then one day the cracks in their seemingly perfect marriage began to show. It was the small things at first, slight changes in routine, missed texts, and those odd moments of silence that neither of them could explain. But what would start as a small crack would eventually shatter their perfect world. Nelson had just returned from a 2-week trip to the oil rig, exhausted but eager to get back into his familiar routine. He arrived home, greeted by the smell of Everly's cooking and the sight of her standing in the kitchen, a warm smile on her face. It was like nothing had changed, and yet something felt different. As Nelson made his way into the living room, he saw his whiskey collection lined up neatly on the bar cart, just as he had left it. Or so he thought. His eyes immediately went to his prized Glenlivet bottle. He had left it half full before he left for the rig, taking pride in how little he consumed of it each time. Now, as he gazed at it, he noticed something odd. The level of the liquid had dropped. It wasn't much, just a few centimeters, but it was enough to make him stop and wonder. For a moment he told himself that maybe he was imagining things. Perhaps he hadn't remembered correctly. But something about it gnawed at him, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. He set the bottle back in its place and tried to brush it off, focusing on Everly's attempt to make dinner feel special. But over the next few weeks, the feeling only grew. The empty spot on the bottle was a constant reminder in the back of his mind. He began to pay closer attention, but it wasn't just the whiskey. Small things kept adding up. Everly's lingering text to an unknown contact, the late nights at the office that stretched longer than usual, and the way she avoided eye contact whenever he brought up trivial matters. It was then that Nelson decided to act. Something didn't add up, and it was too much for him to ignore. But instead of confronting Everly immediately, he chose to take a more cautious approach. He set up a hidden camera, not sure exactly what he was hoping to uncover, but needing answers. It was a move that would set off a chain of events that neither of them could have anticipated. The next few days passed, each one dragging with a heavy sense of unease hanging over the house. Nelson, always meticulous, never shared his suspicions with Everly. He told himself it wasn't necessary, that things would resolve themselves eventually. But he could feel the tension in the air. The thought of that whiskey bottle, and what it might mean, kept him awake at night. One evening, when Nelson returned from his job at the rig, he decided to check the footage. His heart raced as he clicked play, unsure of what he would find. But what he saw on the screen shocked him to his core. Everly wasn't alone in their living room. She was sitting beside Ryan, their neighbor, in what appeared to be a cozy, intimate conversation. Nelson's breath caught in his throat as he watched the two of them laugh, their hands brushing ever so casually. But the moment that cut him deep was when Everly leaned in, allowing Ryan to kiss her softly on the lips. The world around Nelson seemed to blur as the weight of the betrayal hit him. His mind raced. His suspicion had been right all along. Everly, the woman he loved and trusted, had crossed a line he never imagined she would. And in that moment, Nelson understood that their perfect life had been nothing more than an illusion. He didn't know what to do next. The rage, the sadness, and the disbelief were overwhelming. But one thing was clear: he could no longer live in the shadow of betrayal. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As the recording played on, Nelson sat frozen, his heart aching with every second. The man he had once been was now gone, replaced by someone who would have to learn how to navigate life without the woman he thought he knew. And with that, the path forward became clear. The life they had built, as perfect as it seemed, was crumbling before his eyes. He could no longer ignore the truth. Something had to change. 4 days after Nelson's discovery, everything felt like a blur. The house, once a sanctuary of familiarity, now seemed like a place filled with empty echoes. Nelson went through the motions, greeting Everly each evening with a forced smile, his mind constantly racing. The silent tension between them grew thicker with each passing moment, an invisible wall separating them more and more. Everly seemed unaware of the storm brewing inside Nelson. She greeted him as usual, preparing meals, trying to maintain the routine they'd shared for years. But Nelson, always a creature of habit and order, couldn't focus on the mundane anymore. Every action, every word, felt rehearsed, a mere facade masking the hurt that he was now carrying. Despite his internal chaos, Nelson decided he would confront Everly. But not yet. He needed time to plan, to find a way to expose the truth without causing irreversible damage to everything they had built. The anger, though powerful, was still mingled with a sense of sadness. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted closure. A few days after watching the video, Nelson couldn't stand the weight of keeping the secret any longer. He began to wonder how long Everly had been hiding this affair. The thought of it gnawed at him, leaving him restless during his sleepless nights. He needed to know more, to understand the depth of what had happened. But more than anything, he needed to know why. Why had she betrayed him? What had caused her to cross that line? His decision to hide a camera had been cold and calculated. But the aftermath was far from what he had imagined. He found himself questioning everything he knew about their life together, every conversation, every shared memory. The vision of their life together had been shattered in an instant. One night, after another silent dinner where the only sounds were the clinking of utensils and the occasional murmur of Everly's voice, Nelson decided to take a more direct approach. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. His mind was made up. It was time to confront her. "Everly," he began, his voice calm but steady, "we need to talk." Everly, who had been absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone, glanced up at him with a smile that faded almost immediately as she noticed the serious tone in his voice. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting the phone aside. "I've been thinking about things," Nelson replied. He hesitated, unsure of how to start. The words were trapped in his throat, but he knew he had to say them. The truth had to come out. "About us. About everything that's been happening." Everly's face tightened in concern. "What do you mean?" Nelson took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say what had been tearing at him for days. "I know about you and Ryan." Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she froze, unable to respond. Nelson watched her carefully, noting the shift in her expression, the way her shoulders tensed. She was caught off guard, but more than that, he could see the guilt in her eyes. You know?" she asked, her voice shaky. There was no denying it anymore, no more pretending. Nelson nodded, his jaw clenched. "I saw the video." The silence between them was deafening. Everly's gaze dropped to her hands, twisting nervously in her lap. Her mind was racing, trying to find the right words, but none seemed to come. She had been caught, and there was no escaping the truth now. "I didn't want to hurt you, Nelson," she whispered after a long pause. It happened. I never meant for things to go this far." Nelson felt his chest tighten. The words she spoke, though filled with regret, were hollow. Nothing could undo what had already been done. The trust they had built over the years was now broken beyond repair. "I've been alone, Nelson," Everly continued, her voice barely audible. "You're always gone, and I just needed someone. Ryan was there for me when you weren't. I'm not proud of what happened, but I don't know how to undo it. I never meant to hurt you." Nelson felt a bitter sting in his heart. The explanation wasn't enough, not nearly enough to undo the betrayal. For the first time in their marriage he felt like a stranger in his own home. The woman he thought he knew, who he had loved so deeply, was gone, replaced by someone who had made choices that he could never understand. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Everly," Nelson said, his voice low, filled with a sorrow he couldn't hide. "I don't know if I can even look at you the same way anymore." Everly reached out to him, her hand trembling, but Nelson pulled away, unable to bear her touch. "I can't do this," he muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Everly's face crumbled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please don't leave me. I made a mistake, Nelson. A terrible mistake." But Nelson couldn't hear her anymore. The pain in his chest was too great, and the thought of their life together now seemed like a distant memory, a cruel joke. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I need space. I need to think." He didn't wait for her response. With one last look at her, Nelson walked out of the room, the weight of his decision heavy in his chest. He had heard everything he needed to hear, but it still wasn't enough to heal the wound. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing for certain. This marriage, this life they had built, could never go back to the way it was. As Nelson retreated to his study, he couldn't help but feel a deep, aching emptiness. The house, once filled with love and laughter, now felt like a cold, sterile place. And in the quiet of his mind, he knew the truth: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed the confrontation were the hardest Nelson had ever faced. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but nothing could have prepared him for the deep sense of betrayal that gnawed at him every moment he spent in that house. Everly's tears, her attempts to apologize, had all fallen on deaf ears. The truth had already been revealed, and it was too late for words to fix what had been broken. He spent his days in a haze, alternating between bursts of anger and overwhelming sadness. Every room in the house seemed to echo with the silence of what used to be. Nelson couldn't remember the last time they had shared a laugh or a warm conversation. The connection that had once been there now felt so distant, like a ghost haunting the corners of their home. Everly, on the other hand, was desperate. She tried everything to reach out to Nelson, sending him texts, leaving voicemails, even trying to engage him in conversations whenever he came home. But each attempt was met with coldness, and soon she stopped trying to speak. She was too afraid to push him any further, yet she couldn't bear the thought of losing him for good. The guilt weighed heavily on her, crushing her from within. Every morning she woke up with a heavy heart, unable to ignore the regret that consumed her. She had made a terrible mistake, and now, it seemed as though there was no way to undo it. She had allowed herself to drift away from Nelson, and in doing so, had jeopardized everything they had built together. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she had taken him for granted. She tried to focus on work, but it felt like the weight of her guilt followed her everywhere. The interactions with her colleagues seemed shallow, her mind constantly returning to what had happened at home. She was trapped in her own mind, unable to escape the overwhelming shame. One evening, as Nelson returned home from work, he noticed something different. The house was eerily quiet. He hadn't expected it to be bustling with life, but for the first time he realized just how empty it felt without the usual sounds of Everly moving around, doing her things. He walked to the living room, where he found her sitting on the couch, her head in her hands. She didn't notice him at first, her sobs barely audible, her body hunched in defeat. It was the first time he had seen her so vulnerable, so broken. For a brief moment, something inside him softened. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but the memories of her betrayal surged forward like a tidal wave, pushing him away. Everly's eyes lifted when she heard his footsteps. She wiped away her tears quickly, but it was too late. He had seen it all. The guilt, the regret, it was written all over her face. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt you, Nelson." Nelson stood frozen in the doorway, not sure what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her everything he felt, the anger, the betrayal, the deep, deep hurt. But another part of him was exhausted, worn down by the constant battle between his love for her and the devastation she had caused. "I know," he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion. "But it happened, and I can't just forget about it. I don't know if I ever will." Everly's face crumpled at his words. It felt like a final blow, even though she knew it was coming. The reality of what they had become, the distance between them, the emotional chasm, was sinking in more with each passing day. She had thought that time and explanations would heal things, but now it seemed clear that nothing could. For weeks, Nelson and Everly coexisted in the same space, but it was as if they were strangers passing by each other in silence. They ate dinner together, but there were no conversations. They slept in the same bed, but the space between them felt endless. Everly began to withdraw into herself, unable to bear the tension in the air, while Nelson immersed himself in his work, using it as an escape from the suffocating reality of his broken marriage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nelson made a decision. He couldn't keep living in this limbo, not knowing whether he could move past this betrayal. He had tried to pretend that things might get better, that time would somehow heal the wounds, but it wasn't happening. The distance between him and Everly only grew wider with each passing day, and he knew it wasn't fair to either of them. He packed his things that night, quietly, without a word to Everly. It wasn't an act of revenge or anger, it was simply the only thing left to do. He couldn't stay, not like this. Not when every part of him ached with the memory of what she had done. He didn't say goodbye. It wasn't necessary. The silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. Nelson left the house that night, the familiar streets feeling foreign beneath his feet. He didn't know where he would go, just that he needed space. He needed time to think, to grieve the life that he had lost. The future, once so clear and bright, was now a mystery. But one thing was certain. He couldn't stay in a relationship built on lies and betrayal. Everly woke up to an empty house the next morning. The absence of Nelson's presence hit her like a tidal wave, and for the first time she truly understood the magnitude of what she had lost. She sank to her knees in the living room, her body trembling with the realization that Nelson was gone for good. Nelson's departure from the house left an emptiness that Everly could not escape. Each morning she would wake up expecting to see him there beside her, but the bed remained cold and vacant. The silence that filled the house was deafening, louder than any argument they had ever had. The absence of Nelson was a constant reminder of her betrayal, of the choices she had made, and of the life they no longer shared. In the days that followed, Everly tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it felt impossible. She went to work, forced herself to smile through meetings and client calls, but inside she was falling apart. The guilt consumed her, creeping into every corner of her mind. She had broken something irreparably precious, and no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't undo the damage. At night, when the world outside was quiet, she would sit alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where Nelson had once been. The whiskey bottle, the one he had cherished so much, still sat on the bar cart, now gathering dust. It was a stark reminder of what they had lost, of what she had lost. Her mind would often return to Ryan, how easy it had been for her to let her guard down, how fleeting the comfort had been. But Ryan wasn't there anymore either. After the affair came to light, he had distanced himself, leaving Everly to face the consequences of her actions alone. The loneliness felt suffocating. She had no one to turn to. Her friends who had once supported her through thick and thin, now seemed distant, unsure of how to respond. They knew about the affair, but none of them had the words to comfort her. They weren't sure if they should side with her, or if they should be angry with her for betraying Nelson. Everly found herself scrolling through her phone late at night, looking at pictures of the life she once had with Nelson. Their smiles, their trips, their quiet moments together, they seemed like someone else's memories now. She couldn't even remember the last time they had laughed together without tension in the air. She thought about reaching out to him, sending a message or even a phone call, but she knew that would only push him further away. The damage had already been done, and there was no easy way to undo it. Meanwhile, Nelson was staying with his parents. The first few days were a blur of exhaustion, emotional numbness, and reflection. He had felt so certain when he left the house, but now, as he tried to settle into a new life, he realized how much he was still haunted by everything that had happened. His parents were supportive, of course, offering him a roof over his head and a safe place to recover, but even their well-meaning presence couldn't fill the void he felt inside. Nelson spent his days working remotely, trying to keep his mind occupied, but the loneliness was ever present. He missed his own space, but more than that, he missed the version of his life that had existed before everything fell apart. The house he had shared with Everly now felt like a place full of ghosts. He didn't know if he would ever feel whole again. One afternoon, as he sat at his parents' kitchen table, his phone buzzed with a message from Everly. His heart skipped a beat. It had been days since he had heard from her. He stared at the message, unsure of what to do with it. She had simply written, "I'm sorry, Nelson. I can't stop thinking about you." He set the phone down, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to reply, to tell her everything he felt, the hurt, the anger, the betrayal. But another part of him knew that there was no easy fix. The truth had already been exposed and nothing could change that. He picked up his phone again, drafting a response. He didn't want to be cruel, but he couldn't lie either. "I'm sorry too," he typed. But I need time. I can't just go back to how things were. You hurt me, Everly. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you. He read the message several times, his heart heavy with the weight of the words. After a long pause he hit send. There was no turning back now. The message was met with silence on the other end. For a long time, Everly didn't reply. And in that silence she felt her heart break all over again. Days passed and Nelson's life began to find some sort of rhythm. He still felt hollow like a shell of the person he once was, but he was learning to live with it. He didn't expect things to ever go back to normal, but he was beginning to understand that maybe that was okay. The person he had been in that marriage wasn't the person he was becoming now. There was healing in the process even if it was slow. Everly, however, was still caught in the whirlwind of her own emotions. She couldn't stop thinking about Nelson, about how she had broken something so precious. She spent hours replaying every moment they had shared, wondering if there was anything she could have done differently. Could she have made him feel more loved? Could she have been more patient, more understanding? The what-ifs ate at her, but they never gave her answers. She only had the weight of her own mistakes to carry. Eventually, Everly decided to visit their old home. She couldn't stay away any longer. She needed closure. She knew that walking through that door would be a difficult decision, but it was something she had to do. She didn't expect Nelson to be there. She didn't expect anything from him, really. She just wanted to stand in the place that had once been her home, the place where everything had gone wrong, and try to make sense of it all. When she arrived, the door creaked as she stepped inside. The house was just as it had been before. The familiar smell of the living room, the layout, the photos hanging on the walls, everything felt like it had been frozen in time. But the silence was deafening. It was empty, devoid of the life that had once filled it. Everly walked through the rooms, touching the surfaces that had once been part of her daily life. She stopped at the bar cart, her eyes falling on the Glenlivet bottle. It was still there, though the level of whiskey had lowered even more. She could almost hear Nelson's voice in her mind, reminding her of how much he valued that bottle. She sat on the couch, staring at the empty space beside her. The weight of the situation hit her with full force. This was her doing. She had let it all slip away. Everly sat in the silence of the living room, surrounded by memories of a life that felt distant now. The house, once vibrant with laughter and love, felt cold and lifeless without Nelson. The weight of what she had done, the choices, the betrayal, crushed her. It was as if the walls themselves were holding her accountable, reminding her of the brokenness she had caused. She looked around, her eyes landing on the photographs of their trips, the moments when they were happy. It seemed like a different life, one that no longer existed. Nelson's absence was a constant reminder that everything had changed, irreparably. She felt her heart tighten, her throat closing with the pain of knowing that she couldn't undo the hurt. She had spent countless nights thinking about how it had all spiraled out of control. How could she have let this happen? Ryan had been a temporary escape, someone who filled a void when Nelson wasn't there. But the reality hit her hard now. Ryan wasn't the solution. He never had been. Her actions had only pushed Nelson further away, and now she was left with the consequences, alone in a house that was no longer home. A faint sound from the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Everly turned toward the door, her heart leaping in her chest. She hadn't expected anyone. She had hoped for peace and solitude, but instead, the weight of the world seemed to be pressing in on her. She stood up slowly, her knees weak, and walked to the door. She opened it, half expecting to see Nelson standing there. But it wasn't him. It was Ryan. His presence in the doorway felt like an intrusion, though she hadn't expected anything else. Ryan's face was unreadable, his usual confidence replaced by a subtle sadness. "Everly," he said softly, almost as if he weren't sure how to start. "I thought I might find you here." Everly stepped back, her heart pounding. She had known that this day might come. Ryan had been distant for a while now, pulling away after everything had come to light. But now here he was standing in the doorway of her home. He didn't belong here anymore. Neither of them did. "I didn't think you'd come," Everly said quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wasn't sure if I should. But I had to. I can't pretend everything's fine, Everly. You know that. We both made mistakes, but I can't just walk away without talking to you." Everly felt a rush of conflicting emotions. She hadn't expected this. She had thought that Ryan would just fade away like a forgotten chapter in her life, but here he was, reminding her of her own choices. She had been running from the truth, but Ryan was forcing her to face it head-on. "I know I hurt you," Ryan continued, his voice soft but firm. "I never wanted things to turn out this way. But it was never supposed to be like this. You were my escape too, Everly. I don't know what happened between us, but I can't just leave without understanding why. Everly's heart sank. She had never thought about it that way, about how Ryan had been trying to escape his own problems just as she had. In a way they had both been using each other. She had never meant for him to get hurt, but the truth was she had hurt them both. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice shaky. I've ruined everything. I've ruined Nelson. I've ruined us. Ryan stepped forward, his eyes full of regret. Everly, you didn't ruin anything. We both made choices. We both have to own up to them. Everly shook her head, the tears that had been building in her eyes finally spilling over. I didn't think it would end like this, she said, her voice cracking. I never thought I'd be here, sitting in this empty house with no one left. Ryan's expression softened and he stepped closer, his hand hovering just inches from her. For a moment, Everly thought he might reach out to comfort her, but instead, he stopped himself. I can't be the person you're looking for, he said quietly. I can't be the one who fixes this. You need to fix it yourself, Everly. You need to find a way to make peace with what you've done. For yourself, not for anyone else. Everly felt the sting of his words, but deep down she knew they were true. She had been looking for someone to fill the void in her life, but Ryan was right. No one could fix what had been broken except herself. She had to make things right, not just with Nelson but with herself. Ryan turned to leave, pausing at the door. I hope you find what you need, Everly, he said, his voice soft. I hope you find a way to forgive yourself. With that, he was gone, leaving Everly standing alone in the doorway, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had never expected to be standing here, alone and broken, but here she was. She had pushed away everyone who had mattered to her, and now she had to face the consequences. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Everly spent her time in the house, trying to process everything that had happened. She thought about Nelson, about how she had let him slip through her fingers. The love they had shared felt like a lifetime ago, but she knew that she couldn't keep running from the truth. She had to make a decision. It was time to face Nelson. Everly spent hours preparing herself for what was to come. She knew she couldn't change the past, but perhaps there was a way to move forward. She needed to find him, to apologize, and to show him that she had learned from her mistakes. Finally, after days of agonizing indecision, Everly packed a small bag, got in her car, and drove to Nelson's parents' house. The drive felt longer than it was, each mile stretching the tension in her chest. She wasn't sure what she was going to say when she saw him again. What could she possibly say that would make a difference? But she had to try. As she reached the house, she parked and sat in her car for a moment, taking a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back. She walked up to the front door, her hands shaking, and knocked. The door opened slowly and Nelson stood there, his expression unreadable. Neither of them said a word at first, but the silence between them was heavy, thick with years of shared history and unspoken pain. Everly took a deep breath. Nelson, she said softly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. The air around Everly was thick with tension as she stood on Nelson's doorstep, her heart pounding in her chest. The sight of him again after all this time felt both comforting and painful. Nelson's expression remained guarded, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity that made it difficult for Everly to gather her thoughts. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, but now that she was standing in front of him, all her words seemed to escape her. Nelson's eyes met hers, searching as if trying to figure out why she had come. The silence between them was deafening. Can we talk? Everly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nelson stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. The invitation felt almost mechanical, but Everly stepped through the door nonetheless. It was strange being in his space again. The familiar scent of his cologne, the faint hum of life that had once been shared between them, all hit her like a wave of nostalgia and regret. They sat down on the couch in the living room, the same place where they had shared so many moments of joy before everything fell apart. Everly could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. She had to say what was in her heart, whether he accepted it or not. Nelson remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. It was as if he was bracing himself for the words that were about to come. His presence, though still familiar, now felt distant, as if the years of their marriage had created an unbridgeable gap between them. I don't expect you to forgive me, Everly began, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. But I need you to know that I'm truly sorry. For everything I did. For everything I caused. Nelson's eyes lifted, locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze sent a chill down her spine. Sorry doesn't change anything, Everly, he said quietly, the words sharp but not unkind. You knew what you were doing when you made those choices. You knew how it would affect me. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was selfish. I was trying to fill a void I didn't even understand. And in doing so, I lost everything that truly mattered. I lost you. Nelson exhaled sharply, his hand running through his hair in frustration. I can't just forget what happened, Everly. I can't go back to pretending everything's okay when you betrayed me. You broke my trust. And I don't know if I can ever rebuild that. Everly nodded, understanding the depth of his pain. I know. I don't expect you to just forgive me and move on. I'm not asking for that. I needed you to know how sorry I am. I can't undo what I did, but I want to make things right, even if that means stepping away completely. The room seemed to shrink around them as the weight of her words settled. Nelson sat back, his arms crossed as if trying to shield himself from the pain of her confession. There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice softer, almost resigned. You say you want to make things right, but how can you, Everly? How can you fix something that's already broken beyond repair? Nelson's words were filled with a quiet sadness, the remnants of a man who had once believed in their love, only to watch it crumble. I don't know, Everly admitted, her voice trembling. But I know I can't just walk away without doing everything I can to make it right. Even if that means we can't be together anymore. I need you to know that I'm truly sorry. Nelson's expression softened, though the pain was still there. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the same eyes that had once held so much love for him. It was clear that she had spent every moment since their separation grappling with the consequences of her actions. But could that be enough? I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Nelson said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the reality of their situation. Trust is everything in a relationship. And once it's gone, it's hard to get back. Everly felt the sting of his words, but she didn't look away. She had to hear him. She had to face the consequences of what she had done. I understand. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I'm not asking for that. I needed you to know that I'm sorry for breaking you. For breaking us. Nelson looked away, his eyes distant, as if he were searching for something within himself. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but it was also a kind of peace, a moment of clarity for both of them. Everly had said everything she needed to say, but the journey to healing, to forgiveness, would take much longer. Whether or not they could find their way back to each other, neither of them knew. I need time, Nelson finally said, his voice firm. Time to think. Time to figure out what I want. I don't know if I can forgive you, Everly, but I need space to decide what comes next. I can't do this without time to heal. Everly nodded, her heart breaking once again. She knew he was right. She couldn't expect him to just forgive her and move on. The road ahead would be long, filled with uncertainty and pain. But she had to accept that, no matter what happened, she had to let him find his own peace, just as she had to find hers. I understand, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I'm not asking for anything more than your forgiveness, if you ever find it in yourself. But if not, if we can't go back to what we had, I'll accept that. I just wanted you to know how sorry I am. And how much I regret everything I've done. Nelson stood up slowly, his posture stiff, but his expression softer than before. He didn't say anything at first, as if weighing his options. After a long pause, he turned toward the door, his back still facing her. I'll need some time, Everly. Please respect that. With that, he left the room, leaving Everly standing there alone once more. She felt a wave of sorrow wash over her, but there was also a sense of relief. The truth had been spoken. She had done what she could, and now, it was up to Nelson to decide what his future would hold. As Everly stood there in the quiet, empty room, she knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the smallest spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Even if it meant letting go.